Hi, everybody. I think there'll be more people joining us on account of the rain and some attributes common to many Greek people. There may be a little delay in forming the rest of the audience, but we should get started. I'm delighted to welcome you to our talk today and to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Haris Milonas. But before we do that, I want to say a little bit about the lecture today. This is the 2023 Hellenic Heritage Foundation, Hellenic Canadian Academics Association of Ontario, and Hellenic Studies Program annual lecture. The title, as you can read through the slide, is The Greek Constitutive Story and the Compulsory Population Exchange of 1923. My name is Phil Triandafilopoulos. I'm Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Today's lecture would not have been possible without the generous support of the Hellenic Heritage Foundation, the Hellenic Canadian Academics Association of Ontario, and the Munk School's Hellenic Studies program, and many people came together to make the event possible. I'm especially grateful to Larissa Yarovenko and Arba Bardi, who helped to coordinate and promote the event. And many thanks to my dear colleague, Professor Sakis Gekas, who's here at the podium, and also the president of the Hellenic Canadian Academics Association of Ontario. Thanks also to my colleague, Professor Ed Schatz, the director of the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at the Munk School. And they can't be with us, but they're really essential part of the Hellenic Studies program here at U of T, Professors Robert Austin and Themis Aravositas. And many thanks to Tony Lourakis, Patty Keroglidis, George Keroglidis, Sandra Jonas, and all of our amazingly generous friends at the Hellenic Heritage Foundation. The HHF's efforts to preserve and promote and advance Hellenic education, culture, and heritage in Canada has helped us and many others immeasurably, and we're very grateful for their support. And since I'm at the podium and I have a chance, I can plug a very interesting podcast by Sandra Jonas and Tina Tzazanis titled Exodus, The Stories of 1922, which will give you a synoptic overview of the topic of today's lecture, the compulsory exchange of populations between Greece and Turkey at the culmination of the war between the two countries in 1922 and stretching into 1923. The podcast is available anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and Apple, and it is another production that was made possible by the generous funding of the Hellenic Heritage Foundation. So who are we going to meet today? One more time, Professor Haris Milonas, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He's also the editor-in-chief of the excellent academic journal Nationalities Papers, and I learned today that Ed Schatz is one of their leading citation getter. A historic best. You're the LeBron James of Nationalities Papers, Ed. That's pretty good. Professor Milonas' research focuses on states' management of diversity. That's a pretty important topic these days. And by management of diversity, we're talking about national minorities, immigrants, diasporas, and refugees, among others. Milonas is the author of the award-winning book, The Politics of Nation Building, Making Co-Nationals, Refugees, and Minorities. And I was really heartened to see one of our young colleagues bring the Greek translation of the book to Haris just now to have it signed. And apparently the Greek translation is better than the original English version, right? That's impressive. He's also the co-editor of Enemies Within, The Global Politics of Fifth Columns, which sounds amazing. Haven't read that one yet. And it is depressing, but interesting. That's our business. And The Micro Foundations of Diaspora Politics, He has a new book coming out soon, co-authored with Professor Maya Tudor, titled Varieties of Nationalism, Communities, Narratives, and Identities. It's true, Haris Milonas publishes faster than I read, unfortunately for me. Professor Milonas received his PhD from Yale University and was supervised during his doctoral studies by one of our earlier speakers at this event a few years ago, Professor Stathis Kalivas, who's now at Oxford University. He went on and was an Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies, and he recently served as Associate Dean for Research, which in our world is a very important position in a research university at the Elliott School of International Affairs. And next year, he's very lucky, he's going to spend his sabbatical in Madrid, completing yet another book, tentatively entitled Diaspora Management Logics. And he's also a documentary filmmaker. He made a really interesting documentary called Searching for Andreas, a bio documentary of Andreas Papandreou. And one of my first cousins came all the way here, took time off from work, cannot even attend the lecture just to shake your hand and ask for more details about the documentary. So you have to make this more broadly available because I think there's a lot of interest in this, and Papandreou spent a lot of time in Toronto and has roots here still. So I'm lucky to count Haris as a friend whose intelligence, humor, generosity, and collegiality I value very much, and I thank him on behalf of all of us for taking time to visit Toronto and be our very special guest. A few details. The talk will last roughly 45 to 50 minutes. After that, Haris will be happy to answer some questions and engage in discussion. And after that, I'm very pleased to say that we'll have a reception catered by our good friend of the Hellenic Studies Initiative here at U of T, Nikos Nikopoulos, who is the owner of Catering by Nikos. So he and his amazing team are going to be here to set up and feed us well after the lecture. I hope you can all stay for the reception. And with that, I turn the floor over to Professor Milonas.
Thanks. Well, it would be nice if we ended on that note. It was really a high point for me. I'm joking. So thanks so much, Phil. I would like to start by thanking all the organizations and individuals, thankfully they're listed also here, that are hosting this annual lecture. And in particular, as we heard already, and it's worth repeating, the Hellenic Heritage Foundation, the Hellenic Canadian Academics Association of Ontario, the Hellenic Studies Initiative at the Monk School, as well as the Center for Russian Eurasian Studies, represented here strongly by my editorial board member, Ed. And in particular, I want to thank, of course, Phil and Sakis and Robert, who couldn't be here, as well as Larissa Lavoreco. And of course, all of you who made it out here, and those of you who are connecting from the ether, through the internet. So I'm happy you're all here for the annual, what we call the Hellenic Studies annual lecture, I guess, right? And it's going to be a little bit of a depressing topic, but I'm going to try to make you, I'm going to try to make it a little bit more scientific so we don't all weep in the end. It also has some personal overtones that many of you may actually be here because you also have some personal connections to these events. So hopefully that's almost in a sense of a trigger warning, let's say. So this year marks the 100 years since the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, which decided the compulsory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. This population exchange has been used as an important precedent in the discourse concerning conflict resolution and in general conflict studies in the post-World War II era. It has also been singled out as an important causal factor for the development of two national states, namely Greece and Turkey, not surprisingly for you. And it has also spurred a critical debate in the social sciences about the adverse humanitarian consequences and traumatic effects of such policies, population displacement and mass expulsions, as they're often called today. But in today's lecture, we're going to try to explore what was the effect of the famously known, famously called Asia Minor catastrophe, or if you like, the end of the Greek-Turkish War, and the population exchange that followed on the Greek constitutive story. What has been the effect of those important events on the actual understanding of Greek nationhood, or what we could call the Greek narrative, however you want to call it. I'm using the term constitutive story, borrowing from Professor Roger Smith primarily, but you can use any concept you want and use in your work or in your reading. Now, in the early 1900s, and even earlier, but I'm just giving you a ballpark date here, the Greek narrative, the Greek identity, the Greek constitutive story had sort of crystallized. To be Greek, one had to be born in Greece or be born by Greek, to Greek parents, typically speak Greek and be an Orthodox Christian. I don't think any of you, especially of Greek origin here, find this surprising. Now, what you may find surprising, though, and you may not have heard, depending on how involved you are with Greek history, is that during the Balkan Wars, and faced with linguistic and religious heterogeneity of what was called the new lands, the new territories that the Greek state liberated from a Greek perspective or annexed from a more general perspective, I guess, the Venizelos ruling political elites proposed a slightly different, or some would say a dramatically different, understanding of what it means to be Greek. And that constitutive story that Venizelos put forward, but not just Venizelos, all of his collaborators as well, emphasized, rather than language or religion, as I pointed out in the earlier definition of Greek national identity, emphasized national consciousness, ethniki synidisi, right, as the critical element of being Greek. That's a very different type of constitutive story, and I'll unpack this in today's lecture. So basically today, I'm going to argue that Venizelos' defeat in the 1920s, the November 1920 elections, and the resounding defeat that followed of the Greek army by Kemal's forces in 1922, and of course the de facto ethnic cleansing that Greeks were going through in Anatolia by 1923, appended this Venizelist constitutive story, forcing a return to the Greek narrative that preceded it, and was dominant basically before the Balkan Wars. So in other words, I'm going to walk you through this back and forth of the Greek constitutive story. And then I'm going to argue that the 1923 obligatory population exchange sealed this process. Okay? So in the rest of the talk, I intend to also put the events that we're just kind of signaling to right now into a larger historical context of the spread of nationalist ideology through mass schooling in particular, the consequent aversion to alien rule, the idea that you should be ruled by your own people, right? That's a modern concept, right? The emperor of the Habsburg Empire couldn't care less what was the identity of their subjects, right? But that wasn't any more cool anymore later in the time, later in later times. And then lastly, what I call in my first book, the homogenizing imperative that kind of captured the imagination of elites and in a way put them in the trajectory of what we now understand as homogeneous national states. Now, ultimately, I'll argue modernity, which in a way, nationalism was the face of modernity in the Balkans, as you probably know already. Modernity in Southeast Europe took the form of ethnic separation, not integration or multiculturalism. But I hope to demonstrate that this was not an overdetermined outcome or a foregone conclusion prior to the Asia Minor catastrophe. In other words, there was a possibility within the Venizelos understanding of Greek nationhood or Greek constitutive story that had the potentiality of averting a lot of the things that did happen, actually. And we will talk about both the things that happened and the counterfactual, in other words, of how things could have unraveled. So this topic is deeply personal for me, as it is for millions of Greeks and probably some of the people who are in this audience. For obvious reasons, as you're gonna realize by me going through some of my ancestors. In particular, the first person that you see here, the arrow is pointing to. In the mid-1920s, this young man, when he was a young man, Themistocles, who was born in Fatsa as an Ottoman subject, he was forced to flee his ancestral hometown in the Black Sea region and relocate to Greece. His last name was Değirmenci. For those of you who speak Turkish, you know it means miller, and hence my last name Milonas, which means miller in Greek, right? He was my paternal grandfather. Greek authorities suggested to him that he should translate his last name, and he did, and many of you may have similar stories. He was fluent in both Turkish and Pontic Greek, a language closer to ancient than modern Greek, when he arrived in Greece. And his Orthodox Christian background, importantly from our perspective today, made him a prime candidate for the 1923 obligatory population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Now, Themistocles met his wife, Ekaterini, at a refugee village, not surprisingly. She was a refugee from Novorossiysk in the Russian Empire. She was a daughter of a Greek merchant and a Russian housewife. Ekaterini only spoke Russian when she arrived in the harbor of Thessaloniki. She was fleeing then the Bolshevik Revolution, which overthrew the Romanov dynasty and put an end to the Russian Empire. Now, my maternal grandfather, Haralampos, was from the island of Crete. During World War II, he fought against the Italian fascism on the Albanian front, and after the armistice of 1941, he settled in a rural area in northern Greece and married Sophia, another refugee from Pontus, who was also part of the obligatory population exchange, like Themistocles. The Ottoman Empire targeted Pontic Greeks and, in general, Greeks from Asia Minor with brutal exclusionary policies, and the Turkish state that succeeded it continued these policies, which led ultimately to the forced deportation of Themistocles and Sophia. The two families settled in northern Greece, and while my parents were targeted with exclusionary policies, the Greek state targeted them and their children with assimilationist ones. After serving in the Greek military as a reserve officer, my father moved to my mother's town, and their respective backgrounds, which were not exactly the same, did not prevent them from getting married a few years later. Now, my sister and I, that's me in the picture, believe it or not, my sister and I consider ourselves Greek. Neither of us speaks any of the languages that our grandparents spoke, and neither of us identifies with any subnational ethnic identity. We are a living proof that Greek nation building was successful, in the sense that the government managed to promote the Greek national narrative, at least the ethnocultural one that resurfaced after the Asia Minor catastrophe, over any other narrative in the country, right? That's how I define successful nation building. Now, my family's history, as I said, is far from unique. In fact, hundreds of thousands of Greeks have similar stories. These include people displaced by the Balkan Wars, World War I, the Greek-Turkish War that ended in 1922, and ultimately, of course, those forced to leave as a result of the obligatory population exchange in 1923. But how did we get to the Treaty of Lausanne? And was the obligatory population exchange inevitable? Was it an inevitable outcome? If you were, I would argue, if you were to look at the map of the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s, a glimpse of this you can take from that map on the left, of your left, you would see no national borders, right? Because it's only, a homogeneous or a contiguous empire, let's say. However, by 1923, the map starts getting covered by very clear national lines and by states that legitimate their authority through the ideology of nationalism. Famously, for those of you who care about this period, you probably have read Bruce Clark's book, Twice a Stranger. He describes how multi-ethnic or multinational empires gave way not to multinational democracies, but to ethnically homogeneous nation states. According to Clark, nation states were the outcome of the flow of subversive liberal ideas, such as universal education, print capitalism, upon the dawn of the printing press, modern theories of liberty and democracy, and external influence stemming from the rise of capitalism and the role of Greeks and Jews in the process. Yildirim, who is another famous author who maybe less of you have read because he's not as popular of a writer as Bruce Clark, he wrote a book about the exchange as well, and similarly concludes that both Greece and Turkey pursued an obligatory population exchange as a solution in order to address perceived national security threats by ethnically homogenizing their lands. Now, as I've kind of previewed, I'm going to challenge a little bit this canonical, let's say, understanding of this linear understanding, let's say, of somehow the empire collapses, nationalism takes over, and naturally kind of leads to these exclusionary policies and separation. Not that this didn't happen ultimately, but the question is whether there was a counterfactual that was that we're neglecting there. Now, several questions arise surrounding the 1923 population exchange. As I said, was this exchange an unavoidable outcome? What were the conditions that precipitated the collapse of the Ottoman Empire? Why didn't the same thing happen at the same time with the British or the French Empire, for example? To answer these questions, we need to place this diplomatic event, the Lausanne Treaty, into the larger context of the spread of nationalist ideology, the delegitimization of alien rule of nationalized peoples, and the homogenizing imperative capturing the imagination of most rulers of existing nation states and aspiring stateless nationalist movements. So the Ottoman Empire was one of the first empires to face the force of nationalism, no doubt. The vast territories of the empire, ruled over at the beginning of the 17th century, slowly diminished as successful national movements started carving out territories from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, and I'm sure you had some events about the Greek War of Independence for the 200 years. So I'm sure I'm speaking to people who already had to engage with that period. During the 19th century, though, the Tanzimat reform, to an extent a reaction to the successful Greek revolt, institutionalized the pre-existing accommodation of religious difference within the context of the empire through the millet religious community system. And for most of the 19th and early 20th century, the Ottomans still occupied significant parts of southeastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Now, external involvement by great powers and the diffusion of nationalist ideas put pressure on the Ottoman way of life and managing diversity, undermining its multi-ethnic or multi-confessional, let's say, character, and pushing it toward homogenization and nation-building policies. So I'm not denying that there was a zeitgeist or the spirit of the time somehow there. But if we focus more specifically to that period just before the Asia Minor catastrophe, I think we can see a very clear counterfactual playing out. So in today's lecture, I will argue against a teleological understanding of these events, despite the fact that I do think there is a lot to be said about the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times. Primarily, I will do that on the basis of the Venizelos strategy that I alluded to in the beginning, to assimilate non-core groups, what I call unassimilated groups in a society, by expanding the Greek constitutive story rather than relying on exclusionary policies. So in other words, I'm going to argue that Venizelos, faced with diversity, decided, and his government decided that the best way to solve this problem of managing diversity was to expand the understanding of nationhood rather than to actually eliminate the diversity on the ground by either kicking out people or killing them or doing forced assimilation, let's say. Let me unpack this argument. In one of the empirical chapters of my first book, The Politics of Nation Building, whose Greek translation I do believe is better than the English original, that's true, I focus on the nation-building policies pursued by this man, the Governor General of Western Macedonia, Ioannis Iliakis. From 1916 to 1920, Iliakis was, basically Iliakis' authority overrode those of any other state official, including the military officers in the area that he was governing. That, of course, was also because he was a very close friend of Venizelos, who had appointed him there, and they went back to Crete in terms of their friendship, so that wasn't unrelated. Now, Iliakis was part of a like-minded political elite surrounding Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos at the time, including Governor General of Epirus, Aristidis Teriadis, who is famous for his position, the position he had in Smyrna later, and Governor General of Eastern Thrace, Harisios Vamvakas. Those names may be more or less familiar to you, but I'm going to mention a bunch of names to show you that this was not just in Venizelos' mind. It's not that this is the lonely leader who had this vision and no one else shared it with him. It was actually shared by a big group of ruling elites. Minister of Interior and Deputy Prime Minister Emmanuel Repoulis, Minister of Foreign Affairs Nikolaos Politis, member of the Greek-Bulgarian Mixed Commission, Alexandros Pallis, famous for his writings on mass expulsions and population dynamics, and Governor General of Macedonia, Adosidis, and many more that I won't go into right now. So I'm trying to give you a sense that there was a significant group of elites at the time that were governing that had similar mindset with respect to the Greek constitutive story and how it needs to be transformed given the new conditions that the Greek state was facing. What were those conditions? Expanding over pieces of land that were very heterogeneous along language and religious terms. So I'm going to describe some of that in a minute. So the focus of Iliakis' work was the national integration of Western Macedonia, the area that he was Governor General, a linguistically, religiously, and culturally heterogeneous region, to the Greek nation-state after being under the Ottoman administrative system for centuries, following its term under Ottoman administration. So, as I already mentioned, the dominant understanding of nationhood in Greece had crystallized around the end of the 19th century and much earlier as well, one could say, at least since the time of Paparigopoulos. And to be Greek, one had to be born in Greece or be of Greek ancestry, typically speak Greek, and be Orthodox Christian. Now, during the Balkan Wars, however, and faced, as I said, with this heterogeneity in the new lands, as they were called at the time, Venizelos ruling political elites, like the ones I described to you a minute ago, strategically emphasized the importance of national consciousness over language or religion. The views of the Greek elites around Venizelos, and of course Venizelos' views as well, were very close to a famous thinker, Ernest Renan, for those of you who read nationalism studies type of work, as he expressed them in the famous 1882 Sorbonne lecture that he gave that year, where Renan famously said that the existence of a nation is a daily plebiscite, in a way making it very clear that it's all here kind of thing, right? Venizelos clearly stated his understanding of nationhood both before and after he became Greek prime minister. So this is a younger Venizelos. You don't often see him with as much hair. So as we will see below, there is no aspect of Venizelos' understanding of Greekness that suggests his government would pursue exclusionary policies, like a population exchange would be characterized in my view, toward the Muslim population of Greece. In fact, Venizelos lived obviously with many Muslims in Crete and had to collaborate and work with them. Moreover, the political elites surrounding Venizelos, as well as Iliakis, that I studied in my first book, shared his understanding of nationhood. So the first record of Venizelos' understanding of nationhood goes back to an address he gave to the Second Constituent Assembly of Cretans in October 1906. As early as 1906, Venizelos has a very clear view, and he's signaling that his vision for an expanded Greece would require what I'm going to read to you right now. He argued that it is of great interest, and I can't do a very good impersonation of Venizelos, unfortunately. So, it is of great interest for Hellenism to propagate that its understanding of nationhood is so broad and so foreign to religious doctrines, so that within Hellenism can fit not only Christian believers, but also believers in any other known or unknown religion. So not just the people of the book, but even atheists are, welcome to Hellenism, let's say, right? That's a very bold statement for thinking about 1906 being the date being articulated. Venizelos remained on message following World War I with more white hair at the time, when at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, he stated, and I quote again, "Religion, race, language cannot be considered as reliable indications of nationality. The only unmistaken indicator is national consciousness, the purposeful desire of individuals to self-determine their luck and to decide their national family they desire to belong to." Pretty progressive, if you want to use that term, for his time. Now, from the discussion above, it is clear that for Venizelos and his close associates, the population exchange was not a natural extension of their national ideology, but rather a pragmatic choice given the adverse circumstances. And this strategy was not just rhetoric, because some of you may be thinking, well, it's easy to say these things. Did he walk the talk, right? Let's look at some of the policies pursued by the Venizelos while they were in power to see whether there was congruence between their words and their actions, or words and deeds, as Hannah Arendt would say. The first census of in my hometown, Thessaloniki, was conducted by the Greek government in 1913. In total, about 158,000 inhabitants are recorded in that census. In particular, 61,439 Jews, 61,439 Jews, 45,000, about 46,000 Turks, 39 to 40,000 Greeks, 6,263 Bulgarians, and 4,364 foreign or other category. I'm just quoting from that early census. The annexation's most obvious implication had to do with the status reversal between the Muslims, which some people called Turks at the time, because that term, we can talk about this in the Q&A, often is used by Europeans to mean basically anyone who is a Muslim in the Ottoman Empire. Incorrectly, of course, but such is life. The annexation's, as I said, most obvious implication had to do with a status reversal between the Muslims, of course, and the Orthodox Christian population. Overnight, the Greek Orthodox became the core group ruling over the country, over the territory. And around 1915, more than 1/3, something we don't realize, more than 1/3 of the inhabitants of the Greek part of Macedonia as a result of the Bucharest Treaty were Muslims. We don't usually talk about it, but it's a fact. 20% lived in urban centers, while 80% lived in rural areas. Now, based on the ethnocultural understanding of Greek identity, the one that preceded Venizelos' understanding, Muslims were now at best a religious minority, and the worst case scenario was that they should be targeted with exclusionary policies, since they were prime candidates for external support by an enemy, the Ottoman Empire at the time, right? You'll remember that the Ottoman Empire was fighting in the wrong side from the Greek perspective at the time, or at least from the Entente perspective that Venizelos was fighting for as well. I will go into the national schism in a little bit. It's not the most glorious moment of Greek history. So after the incorporation of Thessaloniki into the Kingdom of Greece, Muslims were able to choose the Ottoman or the Greek nationality. In particular, the Treaty of Athens provided for a period of 3 years to choose a nationality. So Muslims living in Salonika, let's say, or other parts, they could opt for Ottoman nationality or get a Greek one. And that was a way to sort, basically, to do what we call, following Brubaker's term, ethnic unmixing, right? This was a policy clearly differentiating the Muslim religious community from the other communities, like the Jewish community and other communities at the time, by encouraging the Muslims who felt strong attachments to the Ottoman Empire to leave. That was natural. So that was definitely there. Now, there was, though, a variation in the effectiveness of this mechanism of ethnic unmixing. That's something we don't hear much about. To begin with, the Greek administration did not pursue its implementation. And again, remember, this is a Venizelos government at the time. For example, between 1914 and 1915, Muslim emigration was prohibited. Moreover, when the deadline arrived in November 1916, which was the 3-year deadline from the Treaty of Athens that I told you about a minute ago, the treaty was not enforced. And of course, it wasn't enforced also because World War I was happening at the time, right? In general, with the exception of cases where there was actually evidence of anti-Greek activity by Muslims in those territories, and there were some cases of that sort, of course, even Muslims who had chosen the Ottoman citizenship were allowed to change their status and remain in Greece if they wished to do so. That's something we don't talk often about, and that skews our understanding and gives more evidence of this linear nationalist model where it was destined to happen, right? The obligatory population exchange was always in the making since day one, let's say. But I think these details kind of problematize some of this narrative. The migration of Muslims to the Ottoman Empire could, and many times did, lead to a justification, of course, of further persecution of Greeks in Asia Minor. So the Ottoman Empire did use this as an excuse to crack down and follow brutal policies vis-a-vis Greeks in Asia Minor, but the Greek state was only targeting, at the time at least, only Muslims who had proven anti-Greek activity, as the archives show us. At the same time, keeping the Muslims in the new lands, just to give you a little bit of a sense also of the other reasons why this was done, was beneficial in two more ways. First, it was good for agricultural production. So there was a very pragmatic reason. And second, it demonstrated the administration's competency in governing over many more Muslims in light of the Greek territorial aspirations that Venizelos had in Asia Minor. Let me unpack this second point. Imagine Venizelos wanted to turn the Aegean into a Greek pond, as he famously said at the time. So showing that he can rule effectively over Muslims in Thessaloniki and in Crete and in Macedonia more broadly, he was signaling to his patron states, let's say, at the time, that he could handle also governing over Muslim populations in Smyrna and so on and so forth, right? So it was almost like a test period to show that, to demonstrate that this was an enlightened government who could actually go beyond these stereotypes that many people assumed at the time, of course, including the opposition of Venizelos, as we will see in a minute. So for the Muslims that did not opt for Ottoman citizenship, the Greek administration believed that they could be ruled easily through the Quran, as they said, and this would happen especially after the Muslims. All of this is from archives, confidential reports. I'm not making it up. So a lot of this is quotations from their own confidential correspondence. They would say, this will happen especially after the Muslims, and now I'm quoting, realized that the Ottoman state would not be able to recapture these territories. During the Balkan Wars and World War I, however, exclusionary policies were pursued, but not fully implemented toward this group. The state of siege law, instituted by the 1864 constitutional revision and reaffirmed in the 1911 one, and the 1871 law on the persecution of banditry, which was extended to the new lands in December 1913, provided the Greek government with a legal basis for selective exclusionary policies. So I just mentioned these two laws. Those were the laws that the Greek government used to target those Muslims that we just heard were demonstrating anti-Greek activity, right? Clearly, if you want to do ethnic cleansing, you don't try to find the laws to justify it, right? Or so clearly, this was very targeted, very what my advisor Stas Kalivas would call selective violence rather than indiscriminate violence towards this group. Now, Glavinas, a historian that I've built on quite a bit, informs us that the provisional government replaced many muftis with the help of the Entente troops, and Muslims that exhibited anti-Greek activity were deported or internally displaced. So I want to be very clear here. It's not that there was no violence and there was no Greek nation building, let's say, taking place. But although it seems counterintuitive, the Greek government did not pursue what I would call ethnocultural exclusionary or assimilationist, forced assimilationist policies vis-a-vis the Muslim group. And upon consideration of the international context that I just alluded to earlier and Venizelos' understanding of nationhood, I think this becomes less puzzling, at least to this audience. It may have been puzzling before I demonstrated some of this or talked about it. Now, of course, the Venizelist version of the Greek constitutive story was not universally accepted in Greece. Hardly anything is universally accepted in Greece. If you've ever lived in Greece, you know that. So in the context of the national schism, ethnikos dichasmos, the anti-Venizelists vehemently oppose this understanding that Venizelos and his friends or his group put forth. And their ideal, the ideal they were putting forth, and in the middle there you see Dimitris Gounaris, who was the leader of the main, the anti-Venizelist, let's say, group that won the election in 1920. I'm going to talk about in a minute. Their ideal can be summarized, for lack of more time here, in the saying "Mikra ala edimos Hellas," which basically we could more or less translate as small but honorable Greece. So to the Greece that would turn the Aegean Sea into a Greek pond, this anti-Venizelist camp was proposing the small but honorable Greece model, which basically implied that Venizelos' strategy to expand Greece was diluting, actually, this earlier ethnocultural, pure-blooded Greek understanding that I started with in the introduction. So there was a lot of romanticism and nostalgia here for the Greece prior to the new lands, prior to this expansion to Asia Minor and so on and so forth. So for more on this period, because I'm obviously just scratching the surface here, I suggest you read my mentor's work, Professor Mavrocordatos' pioneering work, and I cannot possibly do justice to this topic here today. Now, from the beginning, in a way, let me start this again. I think the beginning of the end, as we could, dramatically put it, the beginning of the end for Venizelos' constitutive story, for Venizelos' understanding of Greek nationhood, was the defeat of his party in the November 1920 elections, as I said already. Here is a poster from that election. On the left, you see Dimitris Gounaris that I mentioned. On the right, you have Eleftherios Venizelos. The idea, I believe it's Dimitris Gounaris. I'm not certain about the one on the left because there were 2 or 3 main leaders, but definitely on the right, you see Venizelos. That's a very characteristic figure. And the whole point is that this is such an important election. And if you look into the press of the time, the main campaign slogan for the anti-Venizelists is, "This is the man who has put us at war for 10 years," right? That's it's basically an anti-war campaign coupled with this small but honorable Greece message, right? The whole idea, what in the North American context, you could call that, I guess, a more, I guess what we could say is a more isolationist, let's say, yeah, that's a word, isolationist stance. Now, again, like someone else that comes to mind now, George W. Bush, who was elected on an isolationist campaign in 2000, for those of you who followed American politics at least, or US politics. Clearly, he didn't remain isolationist, as you know, with the Iraq invasion and so on and so forth. And similarly, the anti-Venizelists did actually end up continuing the Asia Minor campaign, but it's important to know how they got elected and what was in their mindset to understand the rest of this discussion. So, as I said, the beginning of the end for Venizelos is this defeat that ironically comes right after the Treaty of Sevres, which is a treaty that basically, basically gives Greece the largest expanse of borders that it had in its modern history. And Venizelos literally thought it would be a walk in the park to win that election. Clearly, he had, he wasn't paying attention to what the resentment and basically how tired Greeks were of being at war for 10 years. And the other side capitalized on that big time. Now, the Asia Minor catastrophe, of course, which I think this picture captures quite well, and the 1923 obligatory population exchange, which followed basically made sure that the Greek constitutive story reverted back to the one that was dominant during the early 1900s, or before the Balkan Wars, let's say. Understandably, as you can all imagine, why the views of all Greek elites changed dramatically after the Greek defeat in the Greco-Turkish War and the massacres that happened, of course. And so the question then becomes, given all this narrative that I gave you, is it correct to see the obligatory population exchange as an unavoidable outcome? I think by now you know my answer is no, at least not according to Venizelos' Greek constitutive story. But due to Venizelos' unexpected defeat in the 1920s elections, at least by him unexpected, the resounding defeat of the Greek army by Kemal's forces in 1922, and the de facto ethnic cleansing that Greeks were facing in Anatolia at the time, the constitutive story was destined to change and revert back to the older one. I think from the discussion above, it's clear that for Venizelos and his close associates, the population exchange was not a natural extension of their national ideology, but rather a pragmatic choice given the adverse circumstances, as I said earlier. With the Treaty of Lausanne, both Turkey and Greece, for different reasons each, agreed on the obligatory nature of the exchange. Through the Lausanne Treaty, the Ottoman Empire and its millet system were thoroughly undone and superseded by national homogenization imperatives on both sides of the Aegean. Just to get a sense of the demographic implications of this exchange, the example of my hometown again, Thessaloniki, I think is enough. The city had 170,000 inhabitants in 1920 and 236,000 by 1928. This 39% population increase can be mainly attributed to the refugees that arrived from Anatolia just in Thessaloniki. The Muslims were exchanged, and the massive settlement of Greek refugees from Turkey following the Treaty of Lausanne completed the Hellenization of the city. Now, was the 1923 compulsory population exchange a success or a failure? That's another pressing question. Well, it largely depends on your perspective, I would say. The Turco-Greek or Greek-Turkish population exchange was not the first population exchange in the Balkans. But due to its large scale, resulting in more than 1 million refugees in Greece and about 500,000 in Turkey, its obligatory character and its relatively organized nature, this population exchange has become a reference point for what Yildirim called in his book the transfer of large ethno-religious groups by means of which minorities were forcibly uprooted under the aegis of international law to contribute in turn to the reconstitution of ethnically pure homogeneous states. Now, recent books attempt to undo the consensus that views the Greek-Turkish population exchange as a success. Yildirim's motivation, for example, for writing his book appears to be his dissatisfaction with most of the interwar, post-World War II, as well as contemporary literature, insofar as they have idealized the 1920s Turco-Greek population exchange at the international level, or they have narrated it in a way that serves nationalistic purposes at home. Similarly, Bruce Clark, in his famous Twice a Stranger, sets out on a journey through Europe and Asia to explore the effects of the Lausanne Treaty and the compulsory exchange it mandated. Clark's study is linked primarily to contemporary debates on partition as a solution to civil wars that some of you political scientists in the room are, painfully familiar with. The author's rationale appears to be that if one can demonstrate that the Lausanne project of ethnic engineering or demographic engineering, often cited as a successful precedent in both theory and practice, was not a success, then the claims for revival of similar solutions in contemporary problems in Iraq, Ireland, or Cyprus would be delegitimized. So you see how this population exchange enters contemporary debates about whether partition could be a solution or population exchange and demographic engineering could be a solution for contemporary conflicts. The only literature that relieves some of these concerns comes from anthropologists, such as René Hirschhorn, and refugee studies scholars that problematize population exchange and request the input of the subjects involved in the actual process. Rather than exclusively viewing the exchange from the perspective of diplomatic or political state elites, many of the examples that are discussed by both Bruce Clark and Gilderim, however, are hardly comparable to the Turco-Greek population exchange and rather constitute instances of disorderly exoduses or unilateral ethnic cleansing. The pain of separation from ancestral homes, as well as the silence in both countries with respect to their multi-ethnic, multicultural past, can be seen as evidence for the failure of the population exchange and the logic guiding the Lausanne Treaty. And of course, Venizelos, as I said, and his group would probably agree with what I'm saying here. However, although the voice of refugees, as Gilderim puts it, is definitely an important lens from a human perspective, it is not necessarily, as I alluded to in the introduction of this section, is not necessarily the only lens through which to evaluate the population exchange, as even Clark recognizes when he writes, "To people who are fleeing persecution, a new country, however unfamiliar, is not simply an alien or hostile place. It is also a life-saving refuge." What would have happened if there had been no exchange? What would have been the alternative policies pursued by Greece and Turkey toward these populations? George Mavrocordatos, for example, has suggested that in the absence of the population exchange, the result would have most likely been a unilateral expulsion of Greek populations. In other words, he has predicted that the Turkish state would have anyways kicked out, if you want, for lack of a better term, the Orthodox Christian community unilaterally, without that exchange, right? So Clark correctly distinguishes between the viewpoint of decision makers and those who were exchanged. In other words, the human perspective. There are many different dimensions along which we can evaluate the population exchange: legal, humanitarian, ethical, and personal, to name just a few. Depending on which ones we choose to focus on and whether we follow a state-centric or a people-centric analysis, we will reach different conclusions. The population exchange was an exclusionary policy that was the closing scene of a long war-making and nation-building process that had begun several decades prior and has continued to an extent to our days. Regardless, although this population exchange was not unavoidable, in my view, and largely dependent on the outcome of the war between Greece and Turkey, the two states, with their decision, turned what they perceived as potentially enemy-backed non-core groups into refugees. In their minds, the exchange was, and I mean the minds of the Greek and Turkish leaders that signed it, the exchange was a pragmatic step towards the future. Peaceful interstate relations would follow based on this agreement, and that actually did materialize, as we also forget, towards the end of the 1920s. Greek and Turkish relations were actually really good in the interwar period from 1928 onwards. And that's something we also don't hear much about today. Now, drawing, I think that's my last slide, drawing inspiration From the traumatic stories of Themistocles, Ekaterini, Sophia, and Haralampos, my grandparents, I shared some ideas about the logic of nation building and how it connects to the 1923 obligatory population exchange. In the process, I think I also described how an ethnocultural Greek constitutive story subsided during the 1910s, but resurfaced again following the Asia Minor catastrophe and remained dominant all the way to the 21st century. In a way, we could say that only with Adetokounmpo we can say that we got to a post-ethnocultural constitutive story, but that's something we can leave for the discussion. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't tire you too much. Yeah.
Harry, thank you very much. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to you, first of all, well, to all of you who came here and those of us online, especially because you took us back to a period and a story that is hardly been told. As you mentioned, this is the period of the post-Balkan wars, Macedonia, North Greece, the new lands, as are often called, and the lives of people, of hundreds of thousands of people, who were Muslim, but also the Christians and the Jewish population of places such as Thessaloniki, but other cities too, in the north. So what we would like to do is first get a round of questions from the audience, but also online. So I'll be monitoring the questions online if we have any. So Phil, what do you think? Should we get some questions, comments from the audience first?
Yeah, please put up your hand and someone will come with the mic. Please use the mic, that way people online can hear your question. And you can introduce yourself too, if you don't mind.
There's a question.
Someone had their hand. Okay.
I can hear you, but I don't know about the rest. Yeah.
Can everybody hear me?
No.
Okay, I'll speak loudly. I have a good voice. I think it was a fascinating narrative and the conclusion.
What's your name? Sorry.
Pardon?
What's your name?
June.
June.
Samaras.
Oh, we've met. Yeah.
What was missing
Long
for
time.
me, and what needs to be done, I mean, it's a history that needs to be written, is economic background to this. First, there's a sort of national economic effect, but the individual personal economic consequences of it as well. And that's what I find difficult for the individuals involved.
I think they fixed the mic.
Sorry, does it still work?
Yeah,
oh,
now
no,
it
it
does,
works.
yeah.
Thank you. I think the individual economic effect on the refugees of what they left behind and what they were facing in the new place. Also, the economic effect of expanding Greece so rapidly with the Macedonian area. How was that accommodated? What effect did it have on the national Greek economy to do that, to have that additional land and potential? Obviously, it led to a lot of agricultural expansion, and it did have an effect in the sense of the resettlement of the refugees. My husband's family had refugee property because of what they left behind, but it didn't match it. So I think there's 2 or 3 levels that I would wish to know more about, would be that economic impact, not just the political philosophy, not just the political mechanisms, but what was the impact on people economically as well as politically and their nationality. I always feel myself that I would prefer a state where the politics happens as a matter of place and not of race. That is one of my undermining philosophies, and I'm Canadian now because of it. But I think that's an area that I would like to know a bit more research on. Thank you.
Let's take a couple, so maybe I'll be able to weave them together unless there are no other ones. I like that one-liner, place instead of race. Any other? Okay.
Thank you. So,
What's your name?
I'm Alexander Kumonteros. So I guess I'm interested in so you mentioned Venizelos' perspective of integrating, wider communities of Greeks, but, post the Balkan Wars, there was a lot of, from the Young Turk perspective, there was a lot of ethnic cleansing and homogenization in Asia Minor. So I guess I'm wondering, could there have been a peaceful solution in the population exchange among the Greeks and the Turks? I'm kind of wondering about if there was already a lot of ethnic cleansing going on in Anatolia, could that have been resolved without the exchange?
Okay, I think that's enough already. Yeah. Can you hear me? I'm not sure. Okay. So, in terms of the economic background, I think Phil may be equally able to answer this, but I'm building on other people's work. You could look at Kodoyorgi's book, Elisabeth, right? Kodoyorgi. She has done a lot of work on that. So there's a book that kind of goes into the resettlement policy. What I can link, how I can link this to my topic, because I'm not an expert on that topic, is that the issue of properties and the issue of, I guess, restitution, or how you want to call it, of properties, was a really important political issue, believe it or not. Again, I'm bringing it back to politics, I'm sorry. Because however a Greek government was handling this, that would obviously impact how these refugees would vote, right? Because they were seeing those governments as doing a lot or not doing enough for them to get their due, right? And in a way, the moment where Venizelos loses the support of refugees, because he does have the support of the refugees for a long time in the elections, is on that matter. It has to do with that issue. So economics plays a huge role in politics as well, so you're not wrong to ask about it. Now, having said that, obviously, from a personal, I can tell you that, my family never got what it lost, obviously, and I'm sure everybody in the room can say something similar. But that's why we're saying this is a traumatic and irreversible kind of process. And I mean, even if you see it more generally, we're talking about communities that were there from, for several centuries, and there is that element too. So it's not purely economic, right? So there is the uprooting element. There is a social capital, human capital element that is also economic, meaning the trauma that debilitates basically the productivity of many people and so on and so forth, besides the loss of human life, obviously. So those are all generally economic effects as well, if you think of them as such, right? So I'm wondering whether you mean the first issue I mentioned, the restitution and the getting their due, or whether you mean the actual broader implications. Or the last thing that I didn't address is how the Greek state integrated them. That was a huge issue, of course, that also pushed for the obligatory population exchange, because what could, after the Asia Minor catastrophe, something that I didn't elaborate on, you have this ethnic cleansing, and that relates to your question. You have this Kemalist army that is, pushing out Orthodox Christians because it wants to create a new Turkish state, right, that is homogeneous. And if Greece were not to push for an obligatory nature of that exchange, where would it find space to relocate these people that are coming, forcibly coming from the newly founded Turkish state, right? So in a way, the Venizelos camp that took over with a coup, obviously, basically right after the Asia Minor catastrophe, that is what I alluded to as the pragmatic reasons why they had to go with the obligatory population exchange. One of them was really they needed the space that the Muslims would leave behind to house the people who were anyways fleeing. So if you look at the numbers, out of the million that is stipulated, several 100,000 had already come to Greece by the time that the signing of the treaty. I don't think many people realize that or appreciate that the vast majority of the people that are to be exchanged, on the Greek side at least, a significant amount of those people had already arrived in Greece before the signing of the treaty. Do you see what I'm saying? So it was an urgent matter, the housing aspect of this. And of course, agricultural policies of, divvying up the lands that they leave behind have also adverse effects sometimes that you don't think of, or maybe many of you don't think of, because a lot of the local populations that are not Muslim, that don't get those lands, but refugees get them, start having resentment for those refugees to this day, because they thought they would take those lands when the Muslims left, and instead the Greek government, the Venizelos, let's say side, gave them to refugees for those. So there is so much to unpack on that front, but there are some more to the point works on that. Now, in terms of Alexander's question, I think I kind of touched upon it with my answer already, right? That this ethnic cleansing was happening, but that was a result of the Asia Minor catastrophe. So my argument was, starting with the election of 1920, so the counterfactual is, if Venizelos had not lost the 1920 election, right, then we don't know what would have been the result of the Greek-Turkish War, right? In fact, we have good reasons to believe that Venizelos probably would not have tried to go all the way to Ankara with his army, and instead would have probably kept his borders. I couldn't cover all of this in one talk, but would have kept his borders around, the Smyrna area, and presumably most of the people who would have to flee then other parts of Anatolia, deeper in Anatolia, they would have gone to those areas of Asia Minor, which means that then presumably Greece would have been able to keep those territories. And the other reason that this would have been more likely is because part of the reason why Greece lost the Greek-Turkish War is because Britain stopped back in Greece. And part of the reason that Britain stopped back in Greece is because Venizelos lost the 1920 election. So there is a lot of moving parts there with that lost election, that of course all of these are hypothetical and counterfactuals, but there is a non-zero probability that what I just said would have been a counterfactual, right? So, and given that the most significant population area or heavily inhabited by Greeks population areas were in the Asia Minor front, and in Istanbul, of course, and Constantinople, I have a sense that the population exchange would not have been necessary. And on top of that, you need to add the element that most likely Venizelos would not have gone back to his promises to the British, and you would have kept the Muslim population of Asia Minor under his administration, as he had done up to that point, with Aristides Teriadis and all that, right? So, and he would be happy to keep the Muslims of Crete and the Muslims of many other parts of Greece. That's my counterfactual, at least. That, in a way, thank you, because your question kind of helped me push fully my counterfactual. I didn't want to take too much time. Yeah. I guess my counterfactual raised a lot of questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Hello, my name is Barry.
Barry?
Barry, yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. And my question, you mentioned that during the schism, the anti-Venizelos side, one of their thoughts was they resented some aspects about the new territory that got added after the Balkan Wars. And I'm curious to know what specifically it was they were unhappy about with those places and the probably who lived there and what exactly that amounted to. I'm curious to know what that was. Yes.
We have two more, I think. One here and one there. Thank you.
Hello, Tina Martinianaci. My question relates to some of the other institutions that might be influencing the populace, leading to the loss of Venizelos' election. I'm wondering what was happening with the church at that time, and how did they feel about that secular political vision for nation building? That was one element. And what about all the other ethnic groups who were watching in this happened to what initially could have been someone calling themselves Turkish, all of a sudden turned to someone of a particular faith. You went very quickly from that
Say
position.
it again, the second one?
You
unpack the second question a little bit.
Yeah, I was...
Which ethnic groups are you referring to?
The Jewish groups, for example,
yeah.
or those in the census who might have fallen into other religious categories, Catholics, etc. You went very quickly, obviously for time.
I have a whole book on that, so
I
please read
appreciate
it.
that, I haven't read it, but I will. But I am curious because you went very quickly from the discourse of Venizelos, which was secularism, we don't care about people's religion, and started using language that was consistent with what was happening, which is, now we care about your religion because we're calling you Muslim, not anything else, and you don't get to call yourself what you want to call yourself. But there's a lot of in between, right? And I'm wondering what role schools had and education policies at the time in promoting that countervision that took hold afterwards. And then finally, why is it that even though we have that countervision taking hold, that counter discourse, we still claim Asia Minor as Greek in our narrative? We talk about it as being Greek.
Excellent. You'll love my book.
Thank you so much. Professor Mylonas, thank you so much for your presentation. My question is specifically about the two visions of Greece that the political elite of Greece had in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I was wondering to what extent Venizelos' conceptions of Greekness,
Christos, right?
Christos Paschalidis, yes, which is very broad and more inclusive and congruent with our contemporary notion of citizenship. I was wondering if in your study of Venizelos, have you come across the notion if there is antecedents in terms of Greekness in Byzantium, which again has a more perhaps a universalist aspect in terms of they're Christian but they're Greek speaking. I mean there's another question there whether or not the Byzantines are Greek because they define themselves as Roman, right? They're Greek speaking yet they refer to themselves as Roman, but definitely their identity has sort of more of a universal scope. So you can be Christian, but you can be Armenian, Greek, Syrian. Or I was wondering if Venizelos' vision of Greekness is informed from the ancients, in the sense that a Greek is whoever participates in Greek education, as Socrates says. So that's one question. The question is, is he informed from the past or no? And a related question to that is, do these different conceptions of Greekness, one from Venizelos and one from Gounaris, do you think that Gounaris' version is more Hellenic, whereas Venizelos, having this more open, inclusive, broad identification, has a non-Hellenic focus, which ultimately allows Greece to go beyond, sort of what we call, an Eladitis or a Hellenic consciousness. I apologize for being very wordy. Thank you again for the great presentation.
Great questions. Wow. A lot of good questions. It's almost like we collaborated so that I can say the things I didn't say during the talk. We didn't. So let me start. Actually, I won't go with the. It's more natural to start differently, and then I'll get to all of the questions. So to Tina's questions, I think first, because that's kind of, or maybe I'll start with Christos because that's the big picture. So and there are easier answers. Venizelos is to my knowledge, the only, and probably forever, the only prime minister of Greece who could actually translate Thucydides from the original to modern Greek. Let's put it very bluntly. I don't think there was ever any prime minister in Greece who could actually do that. So definitely antiquity is the answer there. And he did. So if you haven't read Thucydides in modern Greek, read Venizelos' translation. So there is definitely an influence of not just the Socrates period, but also Hellenistic times period, right? So I thought with the second question, you would go with the distinction between Helladic versus Hellenistic, right? Or because he does mention Hellenism in his own quote, and trying to say that Hellenism is something more than race. It's more like, it's not even place, it's education for him, right? Going back to your point, it's will. And if Ed wants to be Greek, he can be Greek for Venizelos, right? It's the Renanian kind of modern conception of self-determination. You can of a sense of voluntarism. Sartre would be very jealous of Venizelos' understanding of Greekness. So it was very much in line with that. Now that gives me a good segue to go to Tina's question. What does it mean that Asia Minor is Greek? That's a really, I think I'll start with your last one. I think that's a good puzzle given what I set out there. And Venizelos is very adamant about that. And in fact, in my book, I make a very critical comment about Venizelos in terms of priorities. He actually, from an ethnocultural understanding, he kind of, are we recording? We're recording, yeah. Okay, I won't say it, I'll say it politely. He kind of prioritizes Asia Minor over other communities, like, for example, the Greek communities in monastery, for example, in contemporary North Macedonia, for example. And the people who are from there are not happy about that, obviously. To this day, I have some friends whose parents are from there, and they're like, why didn't he send troops? Why did he not demand those territories who were actually much more homogeneously Hellenized or Greek, however you want to put it, and he went for areas that were much less, right? And in a way, that's kind of answering my question to you. His vision was not based on ethnocultural understanding. And his vision was more, I hate to say this, but it was more what we could, in contemporary terms, understand as small I imperialist. I don't mean it in a negative sense for that time. Obviously, for today, it cannot have a positive sense. But for his time, the small I imperialist, in his mind, he was copying who? Britain. There is no other bigger model at the time for anyone who is a Democrat or a cosmopolitan. Britain is the place to copy, right? I mean, so and that's something, and again, that I didn't have time to elaborate. In my eyes, Venizelos, and I don't know, I'm not going to go into conspiracy theories to what extent the British cultivated Venizelos while he was in Crete and helped him become the leader of the Cretan. There are some stories of that sort, and some of them have some fire under the smoke. It's not completely conspiratorial, but regardless, I mean, there is no doubt that Venizelos had his own mindset as well, but there is no doubt that he's influenced and admires the British Empire. And I think to an extent, when he is articulating his Ionian vision, to use Llewellyn Smith's kind of title, he's definitely thinking of Greece as a miniature United Kingdom. And he's thinking, well, the British can rule over a lot of Muslims in India. Why can we not rule over a lot of Muslims under Greek administration? And he's thinking of the Greek administration as something that has to do with Weberian rational government. He's not thinking it from the perspective of narrowly defined nationalism as alien rule, as I said, and all that. He's thinking, and he constantly talks in confidential reports about what we call Christi diikisi. In other words, I don't know how to translate that. Christi diikisi is kind of like, proper government, let's say, or like appropriate governance. In other words, if we rule them well, they're going to be loyal to us. And they're going to see the light, and they're going to understand that it's better for them to be ruled by Greeks than by Turks or by Bulgarians or what have you. I'm slowly building towards the other questions. So that's a revolutionary thinking. Obviously, not everybody who votes for Venizelos understands what I'm telling you right now, right? But his close collaborators do get it. And that's kind of the model he's trying to propose in Crete, and then he tries to bring it in Greece proper when he's invited by the Stratiotikos Sύνδεσμος, or the military, I guess. How do you translate band? Yeah, the military band. Okay, so I think I kind of touched upon that. Now, the church or other institutions. So the biggest institution I kind of didn't talk about, again, I didn't talk about it a lot because it was limited, is the crown. That's the most important institution that I left out, but that is all under this national schism discussion. Obviously, the crown sides with the anti-Venizelists, or the anti-Venizelists sides with the crown, depending on how you see things. And the crown, obviously, is compromised, if you want to put it bluntly, because of its connection to the German, royal family at the time. And their proposal is for Greece to remain neutral in World War I. And neutrality at that point obviously means siding, with the enemy of Entente. So the church, I believe the church did side with the crown at the time, but, again, it's not a monolithic, the Greek Orthodox Church is not monolithic, but I think the official church, given that it was also, its, seat was in Athens, half of Greece, as you know, in the national schism remained neutral, and the other half became independent of sort and sided with Entente in 1916. So in that context, I think the official church, right, of Greece was still in Athens, right? Now, having said that, interestingly, and that goes back to the new lands, and it kind of will bring us to the other questions, Venizelos is coming from Crete, and the new lands and Crete have a special relationship with the Patriarchate in Constantinople, right? So all these are not unrelated to the way that the Greek state expanded and was constructed in a way, right? So there is a parallel story that has to do with who has authority in different religious authority in different parts of Greece that we can bring into this discussion. But the autonomous, autocephalous, let's say, Church of Greece is in Athens, right? So it naturally kind of has to side. You mentioned schools. I'm going to mention another institution probably most of you are not thinking about as important, but it was crucial for the nation-building policies of Venizelos and his collaborators. Sorry, I'm taking so long, but is Boy Scouts organizations. Have you ever thought of Boy Scouts as important in Greece? Probably not. Well, Iliakis, my hero, is the person who brings Boy Scouts to Greece. He founds the first Boy Scouts organization, and his vision in his confidential report says, we're going to use Boy Scouts to assimilate everybody in this area. And basically, I had a picture that I didn't show you, not the one I showed you, where it's all these Slavic-speaking, Ladino-speaking, Turkish-speaking, Greek-speaking students and pupils who are all Boy Scouts together, wearing the same uniform, doing, it's kind of a very stereotypical what Canada and the US would see as very natural, what we call secondary associations, which facilitate integration in a place, not race kind of way. And Iliakis was adamant that that's the way to go. He does implement that quite extensively. I'm not saying there were not other policies, and I did talk about some of them, but there was a lot of that through Boy Scouts. Schools are obviously also trying to Hellenize, but again, it depends what you mean by Hellenization. Language is important, but it's not precluding you. Being a Vlach speaker or being a Slavic speaker doesn't preclude you to going to Greek school and wanting to learn Greek, as long as your national consciousness is Greek. Do you see? So these things are not an impediment. They're not reified as othering you. That's what I'm trying to say. Well, for other Greeks, that was enough to other you and tell you, go back to where you belong or what have you. Okay. Lastly, the anti-Venizelos resentment is very, last Barry's question. So I don't know where to start. There was a lot of resentment. First of all, the people who voted for Venizelos were resented by the anti-Venizelists, hands down. So that's the first thing we can mention. The Venizelists were ready to electorally, famously collaborate with Muslims and Jews electorally, Israelites they were called at the time in Thessaloniki, in order to defeat Venizelos. So they were even willing to cut electoral deals with people who definitely didn't consider Greeks and didn't want them to become Greeks just to defeat Venizelos. So that shows you the level of resentment for the Venizelos side. And in fact, after the refugees come, the anti-Venizelists explicitly say that even the Muslims and the Jews, they say even, because from Venizelos' perspective that wasn't a contradiction, but they're more Greek than those people you brought to us. So they go as far as resenting. Why are they resenting the refugees? Because they're pro-Venizelos, right? So you see a lot. I mean, I'm knocking on an open door, I guess, here, but because you know of polarized politics, we see a lot of it today. But basically, you know, your enemy is my friend is basically the anti-Venizelos kind of MO. And it goes as far as denying the Greekness of these people who are kicked out of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey later as Greeks or as Christian Orthodox just because they were politically not on the right side for them, right? So it shows you how polarized, how deep the national schism was. It basically completely warped how they saw the world. Anything that was pro-Venizelos was bad, and everything that is anti-Venizelos is good, kind of thing. Sorry.
If we have time. We don't
Sorry.
have time. But we can make time for one more
great
question.
questions.
At dinner. I think I have two as well.
Yeah.
But we do have,
We have a very
one
patient
more
audience.
here. Because we have the catering outside.
that's
You have
true.
to-
Yeah.
If we didn't have good food waiting for
I
us,
can
I'd
answer
say.
questions while eating.
But why don't we have one more
yeah.
question from the audience?
It's actually also
Thank
good.
you.
It's giving me ideas of where I should expand this if I ever write it. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you. Christina Christara. I have actually two questions, but I'll ask whatever time you've got. One has to do with we know that after the exchange of population, there has been some tensions, let's say, between the people who just settled and the previous Greeks, and these tensions occasionally carry over. Much later, for example, after the World War, during the Civil War, there were slightly different tensions, not necessarily stemming directly from the old ones, between lefts and rights and so on. Today, what is the remnant of all this? What kind of tensions today could be connected directly back to these that were 100 years earlier? That's one of my questions. And my second has to do with this prioritization of Venizelos, of Asia Minor over areas such as Monastiri, as you mentioned. I think you discussed it fine, but I would like to ask, with respect to prioritization of Asia Minor over other areas such as Eastern Thrace, including Constantinople or Istanbul, whatever you want to use, which in a sense is an area geographically a little more connected to Greece. How come this prioritization came?
So it's not, Venizelos definitely wanted Constantinople, there's no doubt. But Constantinople at the time is under international rule. So he can't really demand something that is already captured by his backers, his patrons, let's say, right? So he's hoping that it's going to be an internationalized city run by the Greeks, basically, and at some point they're gonna see the light and, you know, maybe give it to him, or Greece will have more. So there is a muddling through kind of strategy there, given that he cannot obviously tell the British and the French what to do. In fact, Kemal Atatürk doesn't even control Istanbul until 1924, more or less, himself. So the prioritization, I thought you were going to say also of Northern Epirus or Southern Albania today, and that is another thing that I do discuss in the book, the first book, where basically the British told him to give it up in return of to continue supporting him. So Greece actually was occupying a lot of those areas militarily, and basically gave it up because it was told so by the patrons that later on, as in my answer to Alexandros, gave up on Greece because of the electoral result of 1920, in my view. At least that's what we see in the archives, that they explicitly say, we don't trust these new guys, let's stop supporting them, kind of thing. So in terms of your tensions today, so the way that this cleavage survives is, first of all, in terms of, in northern Greece, there are more people of that background, especially Thessaloniki has huge refugee communities. And then that was all kind of triggered again, let's say in the 1990s, when what is, a misnomer, I guess, Rossopodi arrived, like the Greeks from the former Soviet Union arrived in northern Greece primarily. And that kind of rekindled a little bit of that feeling. It didn't last long because quite quickly they saw that they were very different, meaning that these people hadn't lived had lived under communist rule for so long, so there wasn't as many things that connected them other than being from the similar background 100 years earlier. But that kind of brought back some of the use of Pontic Greek that had kind of dissipated. My father speaks it, I understand it, but I don't speak it. I doubt my son will either understand or speak it, right? And I would say that the fact that I can't answer very concretely, although there is something there, is a testament to what I called in the beginning of my talk, the successful nation building of the Greek state, which goes back to the schools and all that. So it's not that nation building only, targeted, the Israelite community or the Muslim community. It also targeted stereotypical members of the Greek community that may not have felt Greek at the time. Although they fit the description, they didn't necessarily have the daily plebiscite. Let's put it that way. And I know that's hard to kind of understand because it's hard to think back at the time when someone who spoke Greek did not feel Greek. But trust me, there were many people whose loyalties were to the Ottoman Sultan and spoke better Greek than me. In fact, they wrote in Hellenistic Greek or could read the Old New Testament in the original, whatever, right? So, but they just have it's a different world. We cannot understand our world because we are products of the modern world. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Yeah, on that note, we're products.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.